Bergen. I run the International Security Program here, and really happy that you're here to. We're rolling out this new report, Bringing Americans Home, by Cynthia Loertscher, who will be amongst our speakers. We have an all-star cast to A, talk about the report, and B, kind of react to it, including Diane Foley, who's the president and founder of the James Foley Foundation, who is publishing the report today along with New America. Luke Hartig, who was the senior director for Counterterrorism in the Obama White House and played a big role in hostage policy. And Rob Saale, who was a longtime veteran of the FBI, who also ran the Hostage Fusion Recovery Cell, which was one of the innovations that happened in 2015 as a result of the extensive hostage review that Luke was involved in, and that also this report is trying to kind of basically give a report card, as it were, and basically make a determination of what's been working, what still needs to be worked on, and what could be improved upon in the future. So I will now turn it over to Diane, who's going to make some introductory remarks. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Peter. I'm so grateful to Peter and the New America staff for partnering with us on this. The James W. Foley Legacy Foundation was founded just 3 weeks after Jim was killed to advocate for the freedom of all American hostages held hostage abroad and to promote safety for journalists. This Bringing Home Americans report is presented in memory of the 4 Americans who were killed in 2014, early 2015, and that included Stephen Sotloff, an American journalist, Peter Kassig, Kayla Mueller, and our son Jim. It is dedicated with great deep gratitude to David Bradley, a private citizen who gave us hope when our government really didn't know how to help. I'm incredibly grateful to our tireless and compassionate researcher, Cynthia Loertscher, who is here with us, who's spent the past 18 months tirelessly listening to hostage families and returning hostages so that we might bring you some of the results of how the 2015 changes have made a difference for Americans abroad. And I'm very thankful for the caring leaders within the Obama administration for recognizing the need for the 2015 U.S. hostage policy changes, and for the Trump administration for keeping the 2015 interagency structure in place to bring Americans home. I'm deeply grateful for all of them. And finally, I'm just thankful for all of you for coming, because it's you folks who are our voice out to the public and to care, and hopefully can help us make the return of brave Americans a national priority. So I thank you for your attention. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Cindy, who was our primary researcher.
Good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Loertscher, and I'm the author and lead researcher of Bringing Americans Home. First, I'd like to thank Peter Bergen and David Sternum, wherever he is, for all their support and for hosting us this afternoon. It's also a great privilege to be able to share the stage with Diane Foley and Rob Saale and Luke Hartig as well. Before we begin, I do want to touch just briefly on Ppd 30. The directive created the Interagency Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell at the FBI, as well as the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the State Department. These are the 2 main organizations our post-Ppd 30 families interacted with. The goal of the project was threefold. One was to give families and hostages and former detainees as well the opportunity to be listened to and to be heard, Two was to assess the policy as well as identify what systemic gaps remain. And thirdly was to work constructively with the U.S. government and to help the lives of hostages and detainees. It's also important to distinguish the difference between a hostage and a detainee. A hostage is an individual who is either held by a terrorist group, criminal group, or a pirate, and a detainee is an individual who is held by a foreign government. And it's important to recognize those differences because the United States government responds differently to those groups of people. Additionally, this report consists of interviews and written surveys. And in order to gain insight, we spoke to many families to understand their interactions with the U.S. government as well as with NGOs. Post-interviews, I did seek out interviews with policymakers, U.S. government officials, and practitioners in order to provide additional context to the report. So who did we speak to? We spoke to 27 individuals associated with hostages or detainees. Of those, we spoke to 5 former hostages, 14 hostage family members, 3 hostage family representatives, 1 former detainee, and 4 detainee family members. Of those 27 individuals, we had 14 separate hostage cases and 4 separate detainee cases. And so of the 14 hostage cases, we also broke that group down into 2. The first group is the pre-PPD 30 family. And we had 10 cases, and of those 10 cases, we had 16 participants where their cases occurred before and ended after the implementation of PPD 30, which was June 24th of 2015. Our post-PPD 30 cases included the groups with both, where their cases occurred during the duration of PPD 30 and after PPD 30. And within that group, we had a total of 6 participants. So what was it like before the implementation of PPD 30? Learning of a loved one being taken hostage is understandably an extremely difficult situation for anyone to bear. Families sought help from U.S. officials, from the White House, State Department, in an attempt to develop foreign and domestic contacts. To their surprise, some U.S. officials told them to simply go away. Others felt lied to or were sent to other agencies as if they were a burden. No one would help us was the cry of several families. We didn't know where to turn to or what to do. It was very frustrating then, and it still is. Nobody helped. I felt like the U.S. government just abandoned us. Overall, families were frustrated over the lack of communication and misinformation being shared between different government agencies. Ultimately, families were left in the dark, trying to navigate this international crisis at the expense of their loved ones' lives. However, after the implementation of PPD 30, hostage families shared a very, very different experience. One of our findings, our first finding, the U.S. government has been more helpful in managing hostage cases. Before the implementation of PPD 30, however, pre-PPD 30 families mostly reported negative interactions with the State Department. One family commented that the State Department was useless and that they couldn't wait to get rid of us. Frustration was over the fact that individuals working the regional desk lacked rudimentary knowledge of the region where their loved ones were being held. It was unclear who was handling their cases, and families would make several requests to meet with high-level government officials, including the Secretary of State, which would often go denied. However, some families, pre-PPD 30, did respond favorably when the Secretary of State did reach out personally and answer their questions and concerns. In one case, the Secretary of State addressed the family's concerns about drone strikes that were occurring where their loved ones were being held. Even though the family was unable to influence the U.S. government's interactions in that area, they did walk away with a deeper understanding of the situation and felt satisfied with the opportunity to voice their opinions and concerns. Post-PPD 30, Post-PPD 30 hostage families also had a very positive response with the State Department, specifically with the Office of the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. Families commented that the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs was absolutely essential. Their ability to discuss their case with relevant diplomatic personnel from regions where their loved ones were being held was very important and helpful. However, families were deeply concerned about the temporary vacancy of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs and requested that it be an early priority for incoming administrations in the future. Families who interacted with the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell also shared very positive experiences and said that the cell was very helpful, consistent, absolutely essential in coordinating efforts. For instance, during changeover administration, hostage families expected to have to start from scratch with new personnel. Instead, they found something very different. Everybody was read up on, which is very important to hostage families because time is of the essence. This means that the priority isn't shifting to bringing up new personnel. Instead, it's staying on focus and on point to recovery efforts of their loved one. In addition, however, some families did comment that the cell could act like a barrier and prevent families from speaking to other government agencies. In addition, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell does not have its own line of funding, which puts limitations on their capabilities. For our next finding, we found that from the perspective of hostage families, there's been an increase in U.S. government coordination and intelligence sharing and communication. For the pre-PPD 30 cases, this was non-existent, essentially, and the reason behind PPD 30 and why we're standing here today. However, even with an increase in government coordination and intelligence sharing, families did report information is still getting filtered, believing that the U.S. government was withholding important, pertinent information to their case. Additionally, the level of completeness of information sharing ebbs and flows, and pockets of siloed information still appear from time to time. Overall, families express their need for more information to be declassified surrounding their case, especially after the death of a loved one. And our next finding, number 3, our general understanding of laws and policies related to the hostage incidents has improved. Overall, post-PPD 30 families just have a better understanding of the laws and policies. However, despite that increase in understanding, there still remains a level of confusion on the policy towards the private payment of ransoms and negotiations with terrorist organizations. Additional questions that do remain are what constitutes a negotiation with a prescribed group? How far does immunity from prosecution extend? Can families and acquaintances be prosecuted for contributing to a ransom fund? Will the U.S. government seize funds from public fundraising campaigns? And finally, are TPIs safe from prosecution who negotiate with designated terrorists or with individuals associated to designated terrorists? In our next finding, for number 4, the U.S. government's ability to share candid assessments and plans regarding recovery efforts of U.S. hostages has also improved. Pre-PPD families, this was a very deep frustration, especially with the fact that the U.S. government knew where their loved ones were being held and recovery efforts were not being made. However, for instance, one family reported that they did receive recovery efforts, but unfortunately, this was only after their loved one was murdered. Post-PPD 30 families thought speaking with high-ranking U.S. officials about the complexity of geopolitical situations and why recovery efforts were challenging are very helpful. And families also had the opportunity to provide their own recovery assessments, even though the government did not accept those assessments themselves, but they felt like a partner and they were able to contribute and be heard, which was very impactful to families. Very strong response there. For our next finding, finding number 5, former hostages and family members of hostage victims want their kidnappers prosecuted and brought to justice. Of our 14 hostage cases, there were only 5 cases where the kidnappers were arrested. Of those 5 cases, 2 sets of those cases overlapped, meaning 2 of those captors had the same captors of those groups. And in only 1 case was a kidnapper prosecuted. Now, for Foley Foundation, we recognize the challenges that are to bring these captors to justice. For instance, just to name a few, we understand kidnappers are often fugitives in foreign countries and difficult to identify, locate, and arrest. And the U.S. lacks viable partners to support arrest and extradition in countries where civil wars have basically eroded the state's authority. Also, prosecutors face evidentiary challenges such as acquiring witnesses, physical evidence tying the kidnappers to the captivity or abduction, and classification issues. More information could be declassified, having classified complications creates another barrier to be able to prosecute these cases in a public federal court. For finding number 6, hostages need continual financial, mental, and physical health support upon their return. Number 1 issue for hostages, former hostages, is continued mental health support. Also, after returning home, hostages have financial difficulties due to bad credit, missing payments on taxes, credit cards, loans, whatever they had. Their life stopped immediately and they can't pay. And their credit went from very good to to poor. Hostages have a difficult time obtaining or even maintaining a job. And this is due to just being overwhelmed from the persistent trauma they experienced during captivity. They also face pressures when trying to work from the public or media as well. Hostages have requested the need and assistance to be able to receive disability or being able to enter a program similar to the Witness Protection Program out of fear of being located again by their previous captors. And my final finding is specifically towards detainees. Americans unlawfully or wrongfully detained and their families do not receive the same level of support as hostages. Mechanisms and resources required to fully support these individuals currently don't exist. Detainee experiences are strikingly similar to the experiences of pre-PPD 30 families. Communication with the U.S. government was consistently cited as a challenge. Families are seeking more regular and transparent channels of communication with government agencies and administrations. All detainee families express frustration with the lack of communication from the U.S. government on the status of their loved one's case and what actions the U.S. government is taking on behalf of their loved one. All detainees' families mentioned that they felt as though the U.S. government lacked strategy for obtaining the release of their loved one. One detainee family shared that they were left wondering if the government cared, continuing to say, "Nobody from the U.S. government helped us," which echoes and mirrors the same statements from pre-PPD 30 families. And finally, one detainee states, "There needs to be a person that handles detainees when they come back, because it's not one person a year, it's not 2 people a year, there are dozens of people, most of them you've never heard of. And we're all going through the same thing as hostages. Some of them end up in financial ruin because of this, and some people end up with mental and psychological problems that could be alleviated with more support from the U.S. government." Overall, since 2015, the U.S. government has put a tremendous amount of effort in improving the way it engages with hostages and families. That said, there remain some gaps from the perspective of hostage and detainee families, and more work can be and should be done to address these concerns. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have and encourage you to look at the report as well. Thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back over to Peter.
Okay, well, so thank you very much, Cindy. And then we're going to hear from Luke Hartig, who played a key role. Sorry.
Mike is going to work on that.
Okay.
Sorry. But
Okay, sorry.
sorry, Peter.
So Luke played a key role in revising the hostage policy. And, we so often hear, particularly in Washington, about sort of bad news stories about the U.S. government and how it's failing in one way or another. And this really seems like a good news story on so many levels, where the government recognized that it wasn't doing the right thing and really came up with a new policy which is largely working. So Luke, walk us through some of that.
Yeah, for sure. And can you hear me? Mic on? And I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's just an honor to be among this group of colleagues and to see so many friends, colleagues, and advocates in the audience. It really is such an important issue. And I'm here today wearing probably a few different hats. As Peter mentioned, I was the Senior Director for Counterterrorism during the 2015 Hostage Policy Review. Today is actually the 4-year anniversary of the rollout of the hostage policy reforms. And I'm also here as an executive at the Atlantic Media Company, where I remain involved in helping our chairman and owner, David Bradley, in efforts to bring home Americans held abroad. So look at this from a couple different perspectives. Regardless of the hat, I mean, I have to say that working on these issues is one of the highest honors of my professional career. So to pick up on Peter's question, where did this all come from? I mean, the real precipitating factor for our hostage policy review was the death of of Jim and of several others in those horrible murders of 2014 at the hands of ISIS. We all recognize that this was a massive loss for the families, but also a real loss on the US government's part. And as we started to peel back the layer a bit, I think we were really shocked at what we found. It was just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And we saw just appalling stories of how families had been treated by their government. We saw really minimal progress on actually bringing US hostages home. And so the decision came down from President Obama and from my old boss, Lisa Monaco, to task NCTC with doing a government-wide assessment of how we were doing and what we could do better. And unlike most government assessments, this was one where we actively solicited the inputs of the people who mattered most on the outside of government here. That's to say, former hostages, the families of hostages. And it was really unique in that regard. The gentleman who led this work was just an incredible leader, Lieutenant General Bennett Sokolow, now retired, and sat down with just dozens of families and heard their stories and listened to them and tried to translate what they were hearing into what we could actually do in government to make things better. And Cindy walked through very articulately, and what is just an incredible work from Cindy, and thanks to the Foley Foundation, some of the challenge that we were facing at that time. But the big ones were things about the families just feeling absolutely left on their own. Either the government was not particularly helping them, or in other cases, the government was running out and doing hostage recovery strategies with very little actual involvement from the people who had the biggest stake in it. That's to say their families. Families were in the dark about what was happening. There was very poor communication all the way around. The US government was coordinating very poorly across it. And it wasn't really clear that this was a priority in a way that we could bring people together around a table and say, we got to work through the really hard issues here. There's many more, and I encourage everybody to read the report because it articulates both the problems we were trying to solve, our progress towards solving those problems, as well as kind of the unfinished business. But let me just elaborate a little bit on what the reforms were supposed to do, and then that's probably a good basis for us all to discuss where we can go from here. So the first thing I would say is that the hostage policy reforms that were released, again, 4 years ago, were intended to make very clear that hostage recovery is a priority. And we heard this again and again that, when people like Diane went in and met with the government, they heard, hostage recovering your loved one is really important to us, but they knew in reality they had a whole bunch of things on the list ahead of that. And we said, no, hostage policy and recovering hostages is an absolute national priority for us. And beyond that, elevating its priority, we need an actual new paradigm for how we think about this. And for us, a new paradigm meant that the US government and the families of those taken hostage had to work in partnership. It had to be a true partnership, one in which the information flowed both ways, one in which both sides respected the other in terms of their relative expertise and their ability to achieve our ultimate goal of bringing our people home. The actual nuts and bolts of what we did is, essentially organizational reform, and that can be hard to grasp, and it can kind of make people's eyes glaze over. But let me just walk through a couple of the key pieces of what we were trying to do and get why this hard business of actually reforming government ultimately leads to good results. So the first thing we did was we created the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. It was really important for us, and I think this is a theme you see throughout, that there were empowered leaders who could make the government work in a way that their citizens needed the government to work. Rob was the second of the Fusion Cell directors. I see Kieran Ramsey here as well, who's the current Fusion Cell director. It was just so important to have everybody sitting in the room together, operating at the top of their game, access to the resources that their agencies provided, but a single accountable official who was running that effort. And I know Rob will talk about some of that. Second, we created a family engagement coordinator. And it was really important that the families knew that they had somebody who could really provide critical feedback back to the government, that could make sure they were getting what they were needed, but when they weren't given what they were needed, they could be an advocate behind closed doors for the family to make sure that we were getting things right. Similarly to that, there is an intelligence community rep, something a lot of people don't talk about much, but part of the idea there was that we would have a single senior intelligence person at the Fusion Cell who could work on the thorny issues of how to share information that often is obtained through incredibly sensitive sources and methods, and how to do that in a way that we are able to share with the family, who often doesn't have, or almost never would actually have a security clearance, information about their loved ones. The special presidential envoy, Cindy talked about that, and that was incredibly important for us as well, to have a senior diplomat whose sole purpose was to bring Americans home, not to advance larger US policy interests and wherever that might be, but to go to bat for Americans held hostage in diplomatic engagement. And finally, the piece that was probably closest to me in my former role, creating the hostage response group, which is a White House convened organization and deliberative group that would allow us to really provide pressure from the highest levels of government to make sure we were doing everything we could possibly do to bring home Americans. And critically, to also create a mechanism to elevate things to the president where needed. There's certainly a lot more to do, and I think what I would close with is just a couple of quick lessons that for me really stand out and maybe provide fodder for future conversation here. You know, organizational reform is necessary, but it's insufficient. At the end of the day, these are human organizations, and you need inspired leaders who are laying out a clear vision for this and are motivating their staffs to do the best they possibly can. That's partly why so many of us in this community were troubled by the slow appointment of the special presidential envoy in the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. It's important to have those senior roles filled and those people driving their people hard. Similarly, when you look at the people who are doing this hard work under the command of these inspired leaders, they need to be focused on executing their job with the utmost competence, dignity, and focus on the singular task of actually bringing Americans home. There are so many turf wars that come into play when we talk about interagency bodies. This should not be a place where those turf wars play out. This should be a place where everybody's singularly focused on the task at hand. The second piece I would say that's really important for us here, and I think we've actually done a pretty good job on so far, is making sure that hostage recovery is a nonpartisan and a bipartisan issue. It's nonpartisan in the fact that you have Rob sitting here, who's a career FBI agent and has served faithfully across many different administrations in many different capacities. But it has to also be bipartisan in the sense that over different White Houses changing administrations, there's still this emphasis that this is an absolute priority for us. I see Chris Costa in the audience here, who led the Counterterrorism Office, chaired the hostage response group during the first part of the Trump administration. This is a great example of somebody who quickly got what we were trying to do, made it a central priority for him, and made sure that the equities of this important mission were represented in the White House. I also think even at the highest level, I mean, President Trump has had a number of big wins in bringing home Americans held hostage abroad, and he and the entire administration should be commended for their progress in that. This should not be a partisan issue in any way, shape, or form. And the final thing I would say is that, and this is more reflecting on my current role at Atlantic Media, is that I can't overstate how important third parties are. And what I mean by that is we, in doing some support to bring home Americans held hostage, we have just been overwhelmed by the outpouring of willingness to support from journalists, from aid workers, from international NGOs, from foreign governments. People want to help. They want to be part of this mission. They want to help. They want to do whatever they can to bring home Americans who are held hostage overseas. And it's absolutely critical that we see a broader community of third parties as partners in that effort. So I'll stop there. I know others have other things to add.
Thank you. So Rob, you ran the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. Tell us a little bit about what the makeup of that cell is, to the extent that you can, and maybe also reflect a little bit on what Luke just said about the question of third parties, because one of the interesting things about these hostage cases is each one is so very different, right? I mean, a hostage case in Colombia couldn't be more different than a hostage case in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. You're going to have to take different vectors to find that person.
Sure, absolutely, Peter. So first of all, I'd like to thank Diane and the Foley Foundation for inviting me here. As Luke said, it's an honor to be with a distinguished group of colleagues. Just a couple of things before I answer Peter's question, I think are just important to highlight as you read the report and start to process it. The first is, if we remember back 4 years ago when Ppd 30 was signed on June 24th of 2014, that hostage enterprise that was created, the hostage response group, the hostage recovery fusion cell, the special presidential envoy, there was no manual on how to do any of these. There was no how-to. There were certain things, roles and responsibilities that were laid out in Ppd 30, but the nuts and bolts of how to do things how these entities would all interact together, all had to be basically picked up on the go, because the folks back then that were a part of that hostage enterprise did not have the luxury of time. They had active cases that were ongoing. So essentially, they were learning to fly the airplane at the same time they were building it. So where we were before the review and where we are now, I think, is remarkable. And as Luke said, there's a lot of work that needs to be done going forward. But I think there's been substantial success in the past 4 years. The composition of the fusion cell is essentially there are 5 elements. You have your leadership team, which has a director and 2 deputy directors. And those positions can be filled from either the State Department, the Department of Defense, or the FBI. You have the family engagement team, which is led by the family engagement coordinator. Diane Ryan's here today, done an outstanding job as the family engagement coordinator during my tenure in the cell. And they're responsible for providing that direct support to the families, making sure that their needs are met. And the family engagement coordinator acts as an ombudsman for the families to make sure that the federal government is holding up their end of the bargain. There's an operational team which has representatives from the Department of Defense, FBI, Diplomatic Security Service from the State Department, Treasury. Representatives from the intel community all sit in the cell, providing that for that intel team. And then there's an external engagement team as well that deal with the media, things on the Hill, and then private organizations such as Atlantic Media, New America, different NGOs. And of course, every organization has to have a lawyer, so we have a representative from the Department of Justice sitting there as well. So, as Peter said, the cases are all very challenging because no case is exactly alike. You can have a family of 4 people being held by the Haqqani at the same time you're dealing with an individual that may be being held by ISIS in Syria or taken hostage by the FARC down in Colombia. So the cases are all very diverse. And then on top of that, when you're with these diverse cases, you're dealing with different representatives from the State Department. So you might be dealing with the South America desk one day on a Colombian case and turn around and deal with the Syria desk, a whole different set of personalities on an ISIS case. So the challenge is there. I equated it to herding cats, essentially. And what I was trying to do is just get all the cats moving in one direction, and you would have a fleeting moment every once in a while when they're all going in a direction, then one would stray, you'd try to pick up the stray, and you're back to that. But overall, we had one equity in the fusion cell, and that was getting hostages home. There are different parts of the government. They may have, you're looking at a region, they have a whole host of equities they're dealing with. But it was always our job and the job of the HRG and the Special Presidential Envoy to remind their parent agencies that we have, our folks are out there and we need to keep them in consideration.
Well, thank you all. Let me ask a general question because Cindy raised an important point about detainees. And just so everybody in the audience understands what a detainee is, there are plenty of Americans who are in prisons overseas for good reason. I mean, they commit some crime in Mexico, they're in a Mexican prison. But what you mean by that, Cindy, is what exactly? When we talk about detainees in this context, you mean unjustly detained in North Korea or Iran or Egypt? Or give us some more sense about that and the scale of that and why the government isn't really dealing with these families in quite the same way.
Well, the challenges with detainees, we're speaking about thousands of people. And you're right, there are some people that do commit a crime and they're being held justly. And there's also several amount of people that get held or released within 30 days. So you constantly have an influx and outflux of individuals that are being held. But the ones we're specifically speaking about are the ones that are technically defined as unlawfully detained. And these are individuals that are being held in regions such as North Korea and Iran, Venezuela specifically, where they've been sitting for years, some over 10 years, where there's just no lines of communication. the best chance some families have is just working through a lawyer to be able to communicate with that prison, to be able to know what's going on with their loved one. There are several families that are just pressing and pushing hard against the State Department because it does touch up on an international conflict. You know, there's a lot of diplomatic reasons why the United States doesn't directly engage with certain countries. So it's a challenge, and the fact that we don't know who these people are, we should be able to put in place some sort of mechanism to be able to identify which one of these detainees are unjustly held.
So Luke and Rob, do you have any thoughts about, I mean, is there a sound reason why the government, I mean, Cindy sort of mentioned, obviously, if we don't have diplomatic relations with a particular country, it makes it more complicated, and there are a number of those countries. But is there a good reason why the government doesn't treat these unjustly detained families in quite the same way, or is it just not, we haven't got to that yet?
Yeah, I think the theory of the case, at least so far, has been that those who are detained, even if unjustly, they have some access to more traditional mechanisms to secure their freedom. Whether or not that's true, we can sort of debate separately. But in the sense that typically, if a government acknowledges having somebody, there may be some communication, at least with the consular section, if not a consular visit. There may be some ability to bring forward a case in whatever the rule of law and court system is in the country that we're speaking about. And so there's a mechanism set up for that, and there should be support through that mechanism. Now, I think it is absolutely worth the conversation now as to whether that totally makes sense or not, especially when we're talking about rogue regimes in places like Syria or North Korea or other places like that. I don't know that all those things hold up. And I think when you look at the case of Jason Rezaian, for example, and the complexities around securing his freedom, I think it's a good case to be made that, you know, that's a kind of case that should be handled in sort of a special section like we've created through the fusion cell and the supporting mechanisms. I think it's definitely, I think there's definitely some reforms to be made there. Where you draw the line, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and so I think it's also important to note, so a lot of the support that hostage families and kidnapped families, and then the actual hostages themselves on their return and reintegration and kidnapped victims receive, that funding comes out of the Victims of Crime Fund, which was a result of the Victims of Crime Act of 1984. And by authorities, that money can only be spent on victims of crime or their families. So unfortunately, you know, if someone is held and they're arrested in Iran by the Iranian government and they acknowledge that it's not a violation of US federal law, there is no criminal case. So that funding mechanism is not available for them. Do I think that there should be some mechanisms established going forward to support some of these families? Absolutely. And that is, I think that was highlighted in the report here, and that is one of the things it's not going to be able to be addressed through the hostage enterprise in its current configuration with the current authorities. You're going to need some legislative and policy changes moving forward to make that happen.
You know, Cindy mentioned something I thought very interesting, which anybody can reflect on, which is the question of ambiguity around ransom. Now, one of the impetuses, as I understand it, for the review was the way that certain people in the White House treated you, and the issue in terms of payment and potentially you being prosecuted for supporting a terrorist organization. So U.S. government policy on has it improved, or is it still ambiguous? And is the ambiguity kind of intentional in the sense that maybe we don't want a very explicit kind of explanation here because every case, as you said, Rob, is different, and if something that was some sort of hard and fast rule, maybe better to leave it ambiguous. So, it remains ambiguous, is I guess what Cindy is saying. So, is it ambiguous better or just ambiguous, or what do you think, Diane?
Well, I think it is something that has to really be looked at individually too, because certainly in criminal cases, you know, some ransoms are paid, and but when it's a situation as ours was, when Jim was taken hostage by a terrorist group, we were told several times that we would be prosecuted for privately raising a ransom. And that was, really, daunting from a lot of the families. I knew at that point that wasn't the case because it had never been happened before. Most attorneys reassured me that most likely our government would not, prosecute us. But our concern was, as a middle-class family, how could we possibly raise a ransom to bring Jim home if I thought donors would be prosecuted?
Yeah.
If anyone daring to help us to raise funds would be prosecuted, right there, that was a huge barrier. So that, remains, and we have families now who are still struggling with some of that as far as how to deal with that.
Well, so no one has ever been prosecuted for doing this.
No family.
No family member. So this new approach doesn't really produce satisfactory answers as far as you're concerned on this issue?
Well, I don't think it addressed it directly.
Okay.
I mean, the President and the Justice Department did make a statement that no family had ever been prosecuted, and our government would not add to a family's pain. But they did not tell a family, well, how would you do it if a ransom was the only way to get your loved one home?
Now, Austin Tice's family has gone ahead and tried to raise $1 million, right? So, I mean, they must have done that with Austin Tice being held, we think, by the Syrian regime.
Well, that's different because the FBI has put out the reward for.
I see. So it's raising money for this reward that the FBI would sort of, how does it work exactly?
Well, maybe Rob,
Yeah, Rob.
can explain it better, but it's not paying ransom to a terrorist.
Yeah, the reward that is involving the Austin Tice case is information leading to the location and successful recovery of Austin Tice, not to pay a hostage taker. The PPD 30 did clarify that the policy of the U.S. government is no concessions, but it went further to say from previous policies that no concessions does not mean no negotiation. So it allows the government to interact with either terrorist organizations directly or individuals that are associated with terrorist organizations.
Yeah.
Where people run in, where that prosecutorial line is that if you're providing a ransom to a terrorist organization, it's considered material support for terrorism. And I think a couple of years ago, the Treasury Department came up with actually released some numbers publicly for the first time that terrorist organizations over a 5-year period or so, and I don't know the exact time frame, but raised over $222 million in funding from ransoms. And there are some groups such as Jane M out in West Africa, Abu Sayyaf out in the Philippines, that almost 100% of their revenue is generated from ransoms.
Yeah. New America did a study of every Western case of terrorists taking anybody since 9/11. I think the universe of cases was like 1,500, and we found that the absolutely worst outcomes were American citizens by the number. Bad outcome meaning continued imprisonment or death. And the only country that came close was Britain, which has a similar no concessions policy. And obviously countries like Germany and Italy and France who will make payments, their citizens tend to come back at higher levels. So so there are very good arguments on both sides of this, because you obviously don't want to be funding a terrorist organization, yet at the same time you want your loved ones to come home.
I think Rob made a very important point, is that our experience was that our government was not allowed to negotiate. And I think there's no way we're going to get our people home if our government cannot engage with captors, if they're not allowed to find creative ways. It may not be ransom at all.
Well, let me ask you, if Gary Nosner was here, and I don't think he is, Gary would say, who was the principal hostage negotiator for the FBI, that in fact, the Obama administration became a lot more hardcore about this than had been the case under the George W. Bush administration or even earlier. Is that your impression, Rob? Mm-hmm. So why? if you can say. Or I mean, certainly, it's a fact that there was more leeway under the George W. Bush administration for these negotiations.
I really couldn't say that.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't really work these cases
Yeah.
under the Bush administration, more under the Obama administration, and then under the Trump administration. But certainly, I use the bank robbery analogy when you're dealing with these organizations. It's like you have somebody that robs a bank and the police show up, and he takes hostages within the bank, and he demands $5 million and a plane to fly him to Cuba. Well, chances are he's not going to get the $5 million of the plane to fly him to Cuba, but should be able to offer him a Coke and a hamburger and a call to his mother to try to create that dialogue to get him to release those hostages.
And of course, no negotiations. There's a lot of wiggle room around some of this. I mean, we met David Bradley, who of course is the chairman of New America and who's been instrumental in supporting a lot of this work. David and Ali Soufan got Theo Padnos out of Syria, who has been held by an Al-Qaeda affiliate, with the help of the Qatari government. Now, I'm not a cynic, but I sort of think that Al-Qaeda didn't just sort of wake up one morning and say, we're just having such a good day, we're going to let Theo go. I mean, something was exchanged with someone, right? I mean, so the fact that the United States is not directly involved in a negotiation doesn't necessarily mean that third parties and other countries can be involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was one of the most important things we were trying to correct with the Presidential Policy Directive, which goes on at considerable length about the ability of both the families of hostages as well as the U.S. government to communicate with captors, and for the U.S. government to support hostage families while they're communicating with captors. I mean, even that bare moment of can you return an email, can you engage in a conversation, I think was something of considerable confusion for the families of hostages. I mean, the bigger question of ransoms, I think Rob's laid it out very well. It's very challenging because we do still maintain a no concessions policy for a number of good reasons. There's some great work, the New America work. I would encourage everybody to take a look at Joel Simon's book as well. I don't know if Joel's here today, but another really interesting read about ransoms and their effectiveness. And yet at the same time, we don't want to be funding terrorist organizations. I think where we were at the time of the hostage policy review, we landed in about as good a place as we could in terms of the Department of Justice, i.e. the people who would actually make decisions on prosecutions, giving a strong nod in this direction that families would not be prosecuted. But I understand that that's still unsatisfactory for a lot of reasons for people who are actually in this situation.
I'm glad that you mentioned Chris Costa, who's here, and the bipartisan nature of this, because I think in the counterterrorism sphere, there's a lot of continuity between the Obama and the Trump administration in terms of policies and a certain amount of the personnel, and also, there's a very professional kind of group of civil servants who've addressing this issue.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think counterterrorism is an area where we've really reached a consensus about the major tools that should be used. Again, I have lots of friends who are still in government working at the NSC and Counterterrorism Office, and great respect for the work that they do every day. But as you've said, Peter, I mean, both in hostage recovery, but the counterterrorism community writ large, I mean, this is a generation of people, whether or not they were in government service at the time of 9/11, they rallied together around this cry of how do we keep America safe from terrorists, and that's from attacks, but it's also those who are kidnapped by terrorists. And I've really, in all my time working in that counterterrorism office at the White House, our discussions were not about Obama. Our discussions were about how do we do what was best to keep America safe.
One final question before we open it up. Cindy raised a really, I think, important point, which is the kind of, what happens when somebody comes home, and what are the resources they can draw upon? Their credit history is completely, torched. They haven't paid taxes in years. They've got probably some, mental health issues. So, like, how is that situation reasonably well addressed right now, or to what degree should it be or could it be improved?
Well, yeah, sure. There are organizations, especially Hostage US and James Foley Foundation, are addressing a lot of these issues and helping families get receivership of some things. However, some of the issues that are outstanding, when a hostage returns home, even when even when they are being recovered by U.S. officials, and they'll be in whatever country that they were being retrieved from, they're still not in a place where they trust even the military, the U.S. military that's supporting them. So there's a lot of trust issues that these individuals are going back and forth with. So when they do come home and they do receive help, they do receive medical and psychological assistance. However, sometimes it's very difficult for them to be able to make that choice to travel an hour away to receive that help. Sometimes that's just very overwhelming. And so there are organizations that do help and try and identify closer areas where they can receive mental health support. When it comes to finances, that's an ongoing issue. I know, Diane, you can speak more into that.
Well, some things are governmental things, like, for example, the IRS being after someone because they haven't paid their taxes, student loan debt, you know, cell phone bills that go unpaid, things like that, that the Foley Foundation is, you know, hoping to engage on some of these issues so that it can be clearer that these kinds of things should not be major obstacles. But as far as the gaps, the needs for mental and physical, you know, a lot of these are real ongoing needs, you know, and that the government, our government presently addresses the immediate need often, tries to make sure they are looked at and all that. But at this point, we're relying on other nonprofits to follow up to the longer term issues, because there are many, you know, and that is where a lot of returning hostages are struggling, frankly, because currently the nonprofit sector nor our government is really set up to take care of these traumatized individuals who are coming back with huge debt, huge mental and physical challenges.
If you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the mic and identify yourself. If anybody have a question. This lady here in front. Right in front.
Hi, Claire Connor from Perseus Strategies, which is an international public interest law firm that represents political prisoners, among others. I really enjoyed the discussion of the distinction between hostages and detainees and the discussion of the Victims of Crime Fund and things like that. And I wonder if the panelists could discuss a little bit more what policy options exist and are being used to sort of pressure foreign governments to release Americans and others that they're holding unlawfully, whether it's conditioning, you know, the foreign aid that we give them or things like that.
Luke, sounds like a good question for you.
Well, it's a really interesting question. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there on this. So one thing that's being considered is this Levinson Act, which would bring a great number of hostages or unjustly detained under the hostage framework in terms of support from the fusion cell, support from the special presidential envoy, ability to elevate to the White House through the hostage response group. I think that addresses a lot of the core structural things that would allow senior people across our government to really dig in earnest and come up with options. Some of the things that I've heard floated around out there are things like improving your ability to sanction regimes on the basis of this, to impound certain funds, maybe something you're talking about of conditioning aid or the such. I think there's anybody who's kind of been in these discussions or followed these discussions around foreign policy writ large knows that, you know, when you sort of elevate something to a high level and you give the mixture of the State Department, the Treasury Department, and others a seat at the table, people come up with really creative options. And in many cases, it's not a need for new authorities. It's just the need for sort of the venue and the ability to raise those up. I don't know, Diane, did you hear other ideas that you've been looking at?
Well, I think you're bringing up a very important point, Luke, is that I think it's very important that the United States government can be very creative about there's many ways to engage with other governments. It's just that we need to pursue them and look at them, you know, be intentional about doing
But
it.
isn't the problem, I mean, the issue is not like dealing with French, it's dealing with the North Koreans or the Iranians or people we don't have any, and whether we're not giving them aid, certainly. In fact, we're in a state of hostilities with them. So it doesn't matter how creative you are, if there's what tool can we possibly use with the Iranians? I thought it was interesting that this half Iranian, half Lebanese citizen was released a few weeks ago, right, Diane? Yeah, and it seemed like an effort to, we didn't get a lot of publicity, but he'd been held for quite some period of time.
But he had a very...
And he had also some American.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know it as well as some, but I know a lot of these cases have been resolved by very smart human rights attorneys who are very aware of how sanctions can be used, ways that the captors can feel like they're getting something in exchange for the prisoner.
Right.
That I really think that can be very helpful in some of those cases.
Rob?
Yeah, I just think it's important that no matter the country, so if you're dealing with Iran, North Korea, whomever, those countries still have to have relationships with other countries. So from the United States perspective, it's important that we find that leverage point of how we can use a third party to put pressure on the Iranians, on the North Koreans. And I think the administration's been somewhat successful with the North Koreans in doing that. They were successful with Venezuela to a certain degree with a couple of detainees. The Iranians, it's a bigger, maybe a little bit bigger challenge.
Let me just add one more thing on this. I think is, I think that the way that the previous administration negotiated the Iran deal with respect to making sure that the plight of Jason Rezaian, Jason's wife, who's not an American citizen, at least at the time, and several others, was absolutely central to any deal making on that. It has to be. I mean, and as we look now at what's going to be the future of Syria, Austin Tice and Maj Kamlamaz and others who are held unjustly by the Syrians, or we believe are at least in Syria, they have to absolutely be central to those conversations. The other thing I would say on that, though, is that even though you have to make these individuals central to these negotiations, you cannot make it that you have to have the perfect diplomatic package in order to get a U.S. person released. We should be saying, look, it's really table stakes to have our people released, and that will reflect well on the rest of our negotiations. But it's not. It's a kind of a precursor.
Cheyenne, in front here.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne from New America. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about publicity. And, I think of France and how strong of a movement there is once somebody is kidnapped, right? It becomes this national commotion and really adds pressure to the government to, do something about it, whatever that something is. Whereas I think in the US, from what I've read, and admittedly very little, that sometimes the government doesn't necessarily want the families to publicize it, right? They say this will hinder the negotiations, which puts the families in situations where maybe they want to raise money, or maybe they think that they can elevate the profile of what's going on. So I'm curious as to whether or not that's changed since 2015. If it hasn't, maybe what the thought process behind that is, and are there countries where you see this work in a way that if that were to happen in the U.S., certain outcomes would be different?
That's a very good question. And I really feel that families today are still in a tough predicament, because the reality is, at least in our country, I think more publicity at times makes the hostage more valuable, or considered more valuable internationally in terms of ransom, or even put up the stakes for negotiation even. So it continues to be a problem, I feel. And that's why a lot of families are really feel they need to keep it to themselves and not tell anybody. But then I think our government And the captors, certainly the captors kind of win in a way because they, get to use the hostages in any way they want. And our government, to be honest, gets off the hook a bit because nobody really realizes how many hostages are being held and how many unjust detainees there may be. So I really feel it continues to be a problem. However, this kind of thing, by raising the issue and by the good work of the 2015 changes and these two very different administrations focusing on this, has definitely brought hope to families. And that has raised the profile of this issue in a good way, I feel.
Don't the families usually go kind of through a cycle where they initially go along with the government, don't say anything, and then at a certain point, about a year in, they say, this isn't working, we've got to try something else, and then they unilaterally...
I would say this about publicity.
Yeah.
I think it varies from case, it's going to be case by case. And to Diane's point, initially the inclination is we are not going to go public with this to try to lower the value of the hostage. Now, at some point, as we're strategizing what the recovery strategy is, we may go public. So we've had hostage families do radio messages in certain areas, put out, the FBI's put out rewards for information on those cases, and the thought is to publicize those cases. So it varies from victim to victim, and then it's also respecting the wishes of the family. Some families are very private, and they don't want their predicament to be known to outsiders.
But I think, and it's absolutely true, I think the big piece is that they have to be advised and that this is absolutely their right should they decide to go that way. It's their right to go public. It's their right to reach out to their legislators. In fact, I would always encourage anybody to reach out to their legislators to make sure that you're driving the government as hard as you can. I think it's one of the things that Cindy really hit on that I think is just so important, is just that, those of us who are sitting here, most of us are work in the Beltway, live around here, and these government structures, although it can be a little bit odd to understand the State Department if you've only worked at Commerce, it's still a little bit, it's that we're speaking the same language. I mean, most families who have their loved ones taken hostage, they're not from around here. They don't understand the way that government works. You have to over-communicate things. You have to answer the same question 3, 4, 5 times with the same level of patience and compassion as you did the first time, because it's a really great swirl to understand Washington even without the trauma of having your loved one taken hostage. So I think that's a really key piece that Cindy's hit on that I think is worth considering going forward.
Gentleman back.
Just stand up so you can see me. My name is Praveen Madaraju. I'm with Pretrial Rights International, who represents some Americans who are wrongfully detained. We've talked a good amount about, well, a little bit about some of the countries that are sort of roguish and not aligned with the U.S., but there are some countries that are more aligned with the U.S. that also wrongfully detain a number of Americans, and I think of like Egypt and China in particular. But my question is maybe perhaps mostly for Rob and Luke. Is there an FBI and DOJ view on charging foreign officials, like currently serving foreign officials in these types of cases? I can think of a couple statutes that have extraterritorial jurisdiction and might apply in these cases, but I wonder if there's precedent and a view within for the policy.
I know there's a couple of statutes out there where some of these cases may be applicable, some human rights statutes, and I think the Bureau they'll look at every tool that's in the toolbox, but for the most part, when you're dealing with countries like Egypt and China, it's going to be a State Department, citizen services, consular affairs, state-to-state matters is probably going to be the most effective means at affecting a release of an American citizen.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. I don't know the answer to that. I would look to far smarter, well, first lawyers, I'm not a lawyer, but smart lawyers in the first place to go back and forth on the potential consequences of doing that. But I think it's a really interesting idea.
The lady back, I think. Yeah.
Kim Sawyer from the Pulitzer Center. And I have a question that's related to the discussion about publicity. And in the appendix, Cynthia, you're talking about the role of former presidents or secretaries of state. And that also brings to mind perhaps famous people in actors or whatever. Do you think that what are the pros and cons of using people like that? And I guess in the past, the one that comes to my mind, of course, is Jimmy Carter, but have other presidents been involved more recently? And, okay, sorry, that's my open-ended question, and I have a very quick other question. Diane, you said that the families members had never been prosecuted if they paid for a ransom. Have others been prosecuted that are not family members?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, if they had, you know, been contributing to terrorist organizations, you know.
But somebody who was a donor to
Somebody that was a donor, I don't know. I don't know. It's just that, you know, that was never covered, you know, so we don't know. I don't know of any.
But just to, you know, on ransoms, one other point. So as Peter mentioned, the United Kingdom is probably more strict than the U.S. on the no concessions policy. So when we're dealing with a lot of these underwriters and insurance companies that work with K&R companies that help facilitate, you know, that individuals or companies have kidnap insurance through these various companies. If a UK-based company is going to pay a ransom, the United Kingdom is going to stop that, you know, even if it's not a British citizen. So if it involves a British company. So based on the fact that 90% of the insurance underwriters that deal in the K&R field are based in the United Kingdom, it's going to be very difficult to, even if you wanted to pay, you know, a ransom, to do it with the UK
But I mean,
government.
to be clear, to a terrorist organization, if it was an
Right.
ordinary criminal organization,
Sure.
it's a non-issue.
Not an issue.
And going back to the good question about using sort of third parties that may have some prominence or.
Right. So one of the things in the last couple of years with the Fusion Cell, you know, we had a motto that basically we'll work with anyone as long as it's, you know, legal, moral, or ethical. And there has been engagement with a group of outside influencers, so people with gravitas, former ambassadors, businessmen, people in the media that have all agreed to come together. They get briefed generally on some of the issues that the U.S. government has, not on specific cases, but we may say, hey, we have Americans that are held in this area. Here are some of the difficulties we have. We ask, you know, in some cases, we're dealing with people that came from the Reagan administration or the Bush 1, Bush 2, that have experience. They've dealt with these countries before. They continue to have contacts, and they're lending not only their expertise, but sometimes their contacts. So, you know, you get countries that may not want to deal directly with the United States government, but they'll deal with somebody that knows a friend of a friend of a friend. And we're able to leverage that. So that has been done by the government.
Sean Naylor from Yahoo.
Hi, Sean Naylor from Yahoo News. You make a strong case that the changes that were implemented 4 years ago have led to sort of better intragovernmental processes and better communication and greater feeling of involvement on the part of the families of hostages. Is there any evidence that that those changes have actually led to more Americans being rescued or otherwise brought home alive? Has it actually improved the success rate of bringing Americans home?
That's a very good question. And, you know, it's hard, John. You know, hopefully Rob can maybe speak to that. But, you know, from non-NGO like ourselves, you know, it's hard because all that information about how many hostages are actually taken or how many unjust detainees is classified information, you know. So it's hard to know. What do you
Well,
think,
I-
Rob?
I don't know. I don't know the exact number now, but so I retired from the FBI in November. When I left the cell, since the cell's formation, over 200 Americans had been recovered who were either kidnapped or taken hostage. Now, granted, there was a large number of those are kidnapped victims from down in Mexico, take criminal kidnappings and such. But certainly, I can point to a number of cases where, specifically a case we had in Colombia, where a number of Americans were down there on a trip. They were kidnapped by the FARC. They were in an area that they thought that the FARC was no longer in operation because of the peace treaty. They got taken. We were notified on a Thursday, and by Saturday they were released. And I think in part was the coordination efforts of the U.S. government with the Colombian government to put an incredible amount of resources and ISR down there to the point where it scared the kidnappers, and they released their captives. In talking with some people that had been involved, that were from Southcom, that had been involved several years prior with the American contractors who were in the plane crash, they said if they had had that type of response back then, that those individuals would not have been held for 5 years, that we would have been able to get to them at the time of their capture. So I do think it's effective.
And I will say anecdotally, because I think this is also very hard to judge, because for all sorts of reasons, because a lot of these cases go on for quite a long time. I mean, you mentioned the FARC case, and see it with the contractors, that was 5 years. So, but I mean, the Trump administration, I think, has had a good record here of getting people out of North Korea, getting people out of Pakistan, and and Luke raised a good issue. Now we're in the middle of this Taliban negotiation with Saal Khalilzad, and I mean, you've got to hope and presume that Kevin King, who's an American who's in very bad health, age 60, is front and center of those negotiations. Because if we're going to, I mean, the least the Taliban could do is release this guy who's potentially dying. A dead hostage is worth nothing. Any other? Okay, Paul.
Hi, Glenn Marcus, Press Freedom Team, National Press Club, and Peter and Diane, forgive me, this is an FYI. It's not directly on point, but it has to do with the Foley Foundation. On Wednesday in the morning, there's going to be a press conference at the National Press Club about the formation. There's going to be legislation introduced for a monument/memorial to fallen journalists to be somewhere in the Washington area. And the Foley Foundation is heavily involved, as is the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders and the Washington Post and all those organizations. So I'll take a moment to say that. Press.org, press.org is where you could get the information.
Thank you. Any other questions? With that, so any other observations that anybody wants to make?
I just want to make, one thing, and I'm a little bit critical of the administration for this, is I don't want it to appear, we've talked about the success of the hostage enterprise and of the fusion cell, the hostage response group, the presidential envoy's office. But I don't want it to appear that we're really patting ourselves on the back, because there are still Americans out there that have been held for a long time. Bob Levinson's been out there for 11 years. You have, Kevin King. A number of Americans have been held for a substantial amount of time, and really, we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back until we get everybody home.
Agreed. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rob.